brought to you by BunnySlippers.com. Check out their brand new Dino sound slippers. Slippers make a roaring sound every 3 steps. Made with green scaly fabric, soft plush uppers, foam footbeds, non-slip grips on soles, and 3 white claws on each foot. One size fits most up to women's 10.5, men's 9. Footbed measures 10.5. Black Clock Audio Tales is a daily podcast that reads you a story, either a chapter of a novel or a whole short story. Join us in our exploration of old ghost stories, supernatural fiction, horror tales, folk tales, fantasy, gothic horror, weird fiction, and cosmic horror. And don't forget to join us for our monthly show about the Cthulhu Mythos. Look for our podcast near the old wishing well in the blasted heath, wherever you find your podcasts. We suggest Podbean or Apple Podcasts. Find us on the web at pgttcm.com and at Black Clock Audio on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and Black Clock Audio Tales on YouTube. Welcome to Black Clock Audio Tales. Check out our new website over at www.pgttcm.com. Edited by Daniel Spitzer, music by Kevin MacLeod. The Chamber, Oppressive Gloom, Despair. Welcome to Part 1, Folklore of Great Britain.
Join us at the end of the month when we talk about the great old ones.
Nip it fit and clip it fit. In a country far across the sea there once dwelt a great and mighty prince. He lived in a grand castle which was full of beautiful furniture and curious and rare ornaments, and among them was a lovely little glass shoe which would only fit the tiniest foot imaginable. And as the prince was looking at it one day, it struck him what a dainty little lady she would need to be who wore such a very small shoe. And as he liked dainty people, he made up his mind that he would never marry until he found a maiden who could wear the shoe, and that when he found her he would ask her to be his wife. And he called all his lords and courtiers to him, and told them of the determination that he had come to, and asked them to help him in his quest. And after they had taken counsel together, they summoned a trusty knight, and appointed him the prince's ambassador, and told him to take the slipper and mount a fleet-footed horse, and ride up and down the whole of the kingdom until he found a lady whom it would fit. So the ambassador put the little shoe carefully in his pocket and set out on his errand. He rode and he rode and he rode, going to every town and castle that came in his way, and summoning all the ladies to appear before him to try on the shoe. And as he caused a proclamation to be made that whoever could wear it should be the prince's bride, I need not tell you that all the ladies in the countryside flocked to wherever the ambassador chanced to be staying, and begged leave to try on the slipper. But they were all disappointed, for not one of them, try as she could make her foot small enough to go into the fairy shoe. And there were many bitter tears shed in secret when they returned home, by countless fair ladies who prided themselves on the smallness of their feet, and who had set out full of lively expectation that they would be the successful competitors. At last the ambassador arrived at a house where a well-to-do laird had lived, but the laird was dead now, and there was nobody left but his wife and 2 daughters, who had grown poor of late, and who had to work hard for their living. One of the daughters was haughty and insolent. The other was little and young and modest and sweet. When the ambassador rode into the courtyard of this house, and holding out the shoe asked if there were any fair ladies there who would like to try it on, the elder sister, who always thought a great deal of herself, ran forward and said that she would do so, while the younger girl just shook her head and went on with her work. "For," she said to herself, "though my feet are so little that they might go into the slipper, what would I do as the wife of a great prince? Folk would just laugh at me and say that I was not fit for the position. No, no, I am far better to bide as I am." So the ambassador gave the glass shoe to the elder sister, who carried it away to her own room, and presently, to everyone's astonishment, came back wearing it on her foot. It is true that her face was very white, and that she walked with a little limp, But no one noticed these things except her younger sister, and she only shook her wise little head and said nothing. The prince's ambassador was delighted that he had at last found a wife for his master, and he mounted his horse and rode off at full speed to tell him the good news. When the prince heard of the success of his errand, he ordered all his courtiers to be ready to accompany him next day, when he went to bring home his bride. You can fancy what excitement there was at the laird's house when the gallant company arrived, with their prince at the head to greet the lady who was to be their princess. The old mother and the plain-looking maid-of-all-work ran hither and thither, fetching such meat and drink as the house could boast, to set before their high-born visitors, while the bonny little sister went and hid herself behind a great pot which stood in the corner of the courtyard, and which was used for boiling hen's meat. She knew that her foot was the smallest in the house, and something told her that if the prince once got a glimpse of her, he would not be content till she had tried on the slipper. Meanwhile, the selfish elder sister did not help at all, but ran up to her chamber and decked herself out in all the fine clothes that she possessed before she came downstairs to meet the prince. And when all the knights and courtiers had drunk a stirrup cup and wished good luck to their lord and his bride, she was lifted up behind the prince on his horse and rode off so full of her own importance that she even forgot to say good-bye to her mother and sister. Alas, alas! Pride must have a fall, for the cavalcade had not proceeded very far when a little bird which was perched on a branch of a bush by the roadside sang out, "Nip it fit and clip it fit, behind the king rides, but pretty fit and little fit, a hint the cauldron hides." "What is this that the birdie says?" cried the prince, who, if the truth be told, did not feel altogether satisfied with the bride whom fortune had bestowed upon him. "Hast thou another sister, madam?" "Only a little one," murmured the lady, who liked ill the way in which things seemed to be falling out. "We will go back and find her," said the prince firmly, "for when I sent out the slipper, I had no mind that its wearer should nip her foot and clip her foot in order to get it on." So the whole party turned back, and when they reached the laird's house, the prince ordered a search to be made in the courtyard, and the bonny little sister was soon discovered and brought out, all blushes and confusion, from her hiding-place behind the cauldron. "Give her the slipper and let her try it on," said the prince, and the eldest sister was forced to obey. And what was the horror of the bystanders as she drew it off to see that she had cut off the tops of her toes in order to get it on. But it fitted her little sister's foot exactly, without either paring or clipping, and when the prince saw that it was so, he lifted the elder sister down from his horse, and lifted the little one up in her place, and carried her home to his palace, where the wedding was celebrated with great rejoicing. And for the rest, the Fairies of Merlin's Crag. About 200 years ago there was a poor man working as a laborer on a farm in Lanarkshire. He was what is known as an aura man, that is, he had no special work mapped out for him to do, but he was expected to undertake odd jobs of any kind that happened to turn up. One day his master sent him out to cast peats on a piece of moorland that lay on a certain part of the farm. Now this strip of moorland ran up at one end to a curiously shaped crag, known as Merlin's Crag, because, so the country folk said, that famous enchanter had once taken up his abode there. The man obeyed, and being a willing fellow, when he arrived at the moor he set to work with all his might and main. He had lifted quite a quantity of peat from near the crag, when he was startled by the appearance of the very smallest woman that he had ever seen in his life. She was only about 2 feet high, and she was dressed in a green gown and red stockings, and her long yellow hair was not bound by any ribbon, but hung loosely round her shoulders. She was such a dainty little creature that the astonished countryman stopped working, stuck his spade into the ground, and gazed at her in wonder. His wonder increased when she held up one of her tiny fingers and addressed him in these words: "What wouldst thou think if I were to send my husband to uncover thy house? You mortals think that you can do aught that pleaseth you." Then, stamping her tiny foot, she added in a voice of command, "Put back that turf instantly, or thou shalt rue this day." Now the poor man had often heard of the fairy folk, and of the harm that they could work to unthinking mortals who offended them. So, in fear and trembling, he set to work to undo all his labor and to place every divot in the exact spot from which he had taken it. When he was finished, he looked round for his strange visitor, but she had vanished completely, and he could not tell how nor where. Putting up his spade, he wended his way homewards, and going straight to his master, he told him the whole story, and suggested that in future the peats should be taken from the other end of the moor. But the master only laughed. He was a strong, hardy man, and had no belief in ghosts or elves or fairies or any other creatures that he could not see. And although he laughed, he was vexed that his servant should believe in such things. So to cure him, as he thought, of his superstition, he ordered him to take a horse and cart and go back at once and lift all the peats and bring them to dry in the farmsteading. The poor man obeyed with much reluctance, and was greatly relieved as weeks went on to find that in spite of his having done so, no harm befell him. In fact, he began to think that his master was right, and that the whole thing must have been a dream. So matters went smoothly on. Winter passed, and spring and summer, until autumn came round once more, and the very day arrived on which the peats had been lifted the year before. That day, as the sun went down, the Ora man left the farm to go home to his cottage, and as his master was pleased with him, because he had been working very hard lately, he had given him a little can of milk as a present to carry home to his wife. So he was feeling very happy, and as he walked along he was humming a tune to himself. His road took him by the foot of Merlin's Crag, and as he approached it he was astonished to find himself growing strangely tired. His eyelids dropped over his eyes as if he were going to sleep, and his feet grew as heavy as lead. "I will sit down and take a rest for a few minutes," he said to himself. "The road home never seems so long as it does today." So he sat down on a tuft of grass right under the shadow of the crag, and before he knew where he was, he had fallen into a deep and heavy slumber. When he awoke it was near midnight, and the moon had risen on the crag, and he rubbed his eyes, when by its soft light he became aware of a large band of fairies, who were dancing round and round him, singing and laughing, pointing their tiny fingers at him, and shaking their wee fists in his face. The bewildered man rose and tried to walk away from them, but turn in whichever direction he would, the fairies accompanied him, encircling him in a magic ring, out of which he could in no wise go. At last they stopped, and with shrieks of elfin laughter led the prettiest and daintiest of their companions up to him, and cried, tread a measure, O man, then wilt thou not be so eager to escape from our company." Now the poor laborer was but a clumsy dancer, and he held back with a shamefaced air, but the fairy who had been chosen to be his partner reached up and seized his hands, and lo! some strange magic seemed to enter into his veins, for in a moment he found himself waltzing and whirling, sliding and bowing as if he had done nothing else but dance all his life. And, strangest thing of all, he forgot about his home and his children, and he felt so happy that he had no longer the slightest desire to leave the fairies' company. All night long the merriment went on. The little folk danced and danced as if they were mad, and the farm man danced with them, until at last a shrill sound came over the moor. It was the cock from the farmyard crowing its loudest to welcome the dawn. In an instant the revelry ceased, and the fairies, with cries of alarm, crowded together and rushed towards the crag, dragging the countryman along in their midst. As they reached the rock, a mysterious door, which he never remembered having seen before, opened in it of its own accord, and shut again with a crash as soon as the fairy host had all trooped through. The door led into a large, dimly lighted hall full of tiny couches, and here the little folks sank to rest, tired out with their exertions, while the good man sat down on a piece of rock in the corner, wondering what would happen next. But there seemed to be some kind of spell thrown over his senses, for even when the fairies awoke and began to go about their household occupations, and to carry out certain curious practices which he had never seen before, and which, as you will hear, he was forbidden to speak of afterwards, he was content to sit and watch them, without in any way attempting to escape. As it drew toward evening, someone touched his elbow, and he turned round with a start to see the little woman with the green dress and scarlet stockings, who had remonstrated with him for lifting the turf the year before, standing by his side. "The divots which thou tookest from the roof of my house have grown once more," she said, "and once more it is covered with grass. So thou canst go home again, for justice is satisfied. Thy punishment hath lasted long enough, but first must thou take thy solemn oath never to tell to mortal ears what thou hast seen, whilst thou hast dwelt among us." The countryman promised gladly, and took the oath with all due solemnity. Then the door was opened, and he was at liberty to depart. His can of milk was standing on the green just where he had laid it down when he went to sleep, and it seemed to him as if it were only yesternight that the farmer had given it to him. But when he reached his home he was speedily undeceived, for his wife looked at him as if he were a ghost, and the children whom he had left wee toddling things were now well-grown boys and girls, who stared at him as if he had been an utter stranger. "Where hast thou been these long, long years?" cried his wife, when she had gathered her wits and seen that it was really he and not a spirit. "And how couldst thou find it in thy heart to leave the bairns and me alone?" And then he knew that the one day he had passed in Fairyland had lasted 7 whole years, and he realized how heavy the punishment had been which the wee folk had laid upon him. The Wedding of Robin Redbreast and Jenny Wren. There was once an old gray Pussy Baudrons, and she went out for a stroll one Christmas morning to see what she could see, and as she was walking down the burnside, she saw a little Robin Redbreast hopping up and down on the branches of a briar bush. "What a tasty breakfast he would make," thought she to herself. "I must try to catch him." So, "Good morning, Robin Redbreast," quoth she, sitting down on her tail at the foot of the briar bush and looking up at him. "And where mayest thou be going so early on this cold winter's day?" "I'm on my road to the king's palace," answered Robin cheerily, "to sing him a song this merry Yule morning." "That's a pious errand to be travelling on, and I wish you good success," replied Pussy slyly. "But just hop down a minute before thou goest, and I will show thee what a bonny white ring I have round my neck. 'Tis few cats that are marked like me." Then Robin cocked his head on one side, and looked down on Pussy Baudrons with a twinkle in his eye. "Ha, ha, gray Pussy Baudrons," he said. "Ha, ha, for I saw thee worry the little gray mouse, and I have no wish that thou shouldst worry me." And with that he spread his wings and flew away, and he flew till he lighted on an old sod dike, and there he saw a greedy old Gled sitting, with all his feathers ruffled up as he felt cold. "Good morning, Robin Redbreast," cried the greedy old Gled, who had had no food since yesterday and was therefore very hungry. "And where mayest thou be going this cold winter's day?" "I'm on my road to the king's palace," answered Robin, "to sing him a song this merry Yule morn." And he hopped away a yard or two from the Gled, for there was a look in his eye that he did not quite like. "Thou art a friendly little fellow," remarked the Gled sweetly, "and I wish thee good luck on thine errand. But ere thou go on, come nearer me, I pray thee, and I will show thee what a curious feather I have in my wing. 'Tis said that no other Gled in the countryside hath one like it." "Like enough," rejoined Robin, hopping still further away, "but I will take thy word for it without seeing it, for I saw thee pluck the feathers from the wee linty, and I have no wish that thou shouldst pluck the feathers from me, so I will bid thee good day and go on my journey." The next place on which he rested was a piece of rock that overhung a dark, deep glen, and here he saw a sly old fox looking out of his hole, not 2 yards below him. "Good mornin', Robin Redbreast," said the sly old fox, who had tried to steal a fat duck from a farmyard the night before, and had barely escaped with his life. "And where mayest thou be going so early on this cold winter's day?" "I'm on my road to the king's palace to sing him a song this merry Yule morning," answered Robin, giving the same answer that he had given to the grey pussy bawdrons and the greedy gled. "Thou wilt get a right good welcome, for his majesty is fond of music," said the wily fox. "But ere thou go, just come down and have a look at a black spot which I have on the end of my tail. 'Tis said that there is not a fox twixt here and the border that hath a spot on his tail like mine." Very like," replied Robin, "but I chanced to see thee worrying the wee lammie up on the brae side yonder, and I have no wish that thou shouldst try thy teeth on me. So I will e'en go on my way to the king's palace, and thou canst show the spot on thy tail to the next passer-by." So the little Robin Redbreast flew away once more, and never rested till he came to a bonny valley with a little burn running through it, and there he saw a rosy-cheeked boy sitting on a log, eating a piece of bread and butter. And he perched on a branch and watched him. "Good mornin', Robin Redbreast, and where mayest thou be going so early on this cold winter's day?" asked the boy eagerly, for he was making a collection of stuffed birds, and he had still to get a Robin Redbreast. "I'm on my way to the king's palace to sing him a song this merry Yule morning," answered Robin, hopping down to the ground and keeping one eye fixed on the bread and butter. "Come a bit nearer, Robin," said the boy, "and I will give thee some crumbs." "Na, na, my wee man," chirped the cautious little bird, "for I saw thee catch the goldfinch, and I have no wish to give thee the chance to catch me." At last he came to the king's palace, and lighted on the window sill, and there he sat and sang the very sweetest song that he could sing, for he felt so happy because it was the blessed Yuletide that he wanted everyone else to be happy too. And the king and queen were so delighted with his song as he peeped in at them at their open window, that they asked each other what they could give him as a reward for his kind thought in coming so far to greet them. "We can give him a wife," replied the queen, "who will go home with him and help him to build his nest." "And who wilt thou give him for a bride?" asked the king. "Methinks 'twould need to be a very tiny lady to match his size." "Why, Jenny Wren, of course," answered the queen. "She hath looked somewhat dowy of late, but this will be the very thing to brighten her up." Then the king clapped his hands and praised his wife for her happy thought, and wondered that the idea had not struck him before. So Robin Redbreast and Jenny Wren were married amid great rejoicings at the king's palace, and the king and queen and all the fine nobles and court ladies danced at their wedding. Then they flew away home to Robin's own countryside, and built their nest in the roots of the briar bush where he had spoken to Pussy Bawdrons, and you will be glad to hear that Jenny Wren proved the best little housewife in the world. The Dwarfy Stone. Far up in a green valley in the island of Hoy stands an immense boulder. It is hollow inside, and the natives of these northern islands call it the Dwarfy Stone, because long centuries ago, so the legend has it, Snorro the dwarf lived there. Nobody knew where Snorro came from, or how long he had dwelt in the dark chamber inside the Dwarfy Stone. All that they knew about him was that he was a little man with a queer, twisted, deformed body and a face of marvelous beauty, which never seemed to look any older, but was always smiling and young. Men said that this was because Snorro's father had been a fairy and not a denizen of earth, who had bequeathed to his son the gift of perpetual youth. But nobody knew whether this were true or not, for the dwarf had inhabited the Dwarfy Stone long before the oldest man or woman in Hoy had been born. One thing was certain, however. He had inherited from his mother whom all the men agreed had been mortal, the dangerous qualities of vanity and ambition. And the longer he lived, the more vain and ambitious did he become, until at last he always carried a mirror of polished steel round his neck, into which he constantly looked in order to see the reflection of his handsome face. And he would not attend to the country people who came to seek his help, unless they bowed themselves humbly before him and spoke to him as if he were a king. I say that the country people sought his help, for he spent his time, or appeared to spend it, in collecting herbs and simples on the hillsides, which he carried home with him to his dark abode, and distilled medicines and potions from them, which he sold to his neighbors at wondrous high prices. He was also the possessor of a wonderful leathern-covered book, clasped with clasps of brass, over which he would pore for hours together, and out of which he would tell the simple islanders their fortunes, if they would. For they feared the book almost as much as they feared Snorro himself, for it was whispered that it had once belonged to Odin, and they crossed themselves for protection as they named the mighty enchanter. But all the time they never guessed the real reason why Snorro chose to live in the dwarfy stone. I will tell you why he did so. Not very far from the stone there was a curious hill, shaped exactly like a wart. It was known as the Wart Hill of Hoy, and men said that somewhere in the side of it was hidden a wonderful carbuncle, which, when it was found, would bestow on its finder marvelous magic gifts, health, wealth, and happiness, everything, in fact, that a human being could desire. And the curious thing about this carbuncle was that it was said that it could be seen at certain times if only the people who were looking for it were at the right spot at the right moment. Now Snorro had made up his mind that he would find this wonderful stone, so while he pretended to spend all his time in reading his great book or distilling medicines from his herbs, he was really keeping a keen lookout during his wanderings, noting every tuft of grass or piece of rock under which it might be hidden. And at night, when everyone else was asleep, he would creep out with pickaxe and spade to turn over the rocks or dig over the turf, in hope of finding the long sought-for treasure underneath them. He was always accompanied on these occasions by an enormous gray-headed raven, who lived in the cave along with him, and who was his bosom friend and companion. The islanders feared this bird of ill omen as much, perhaps, as they feared its master, for although they went to consult Snorro in all their difficulties and perplexities, and bought medicines and love potions from him, they always looked upon him with a certain dread, feeling that there was something weird and uncanny about him. Now, at the time we are speaking of, Orkney was governed by two earls who were half-brothers. Paul, the elder, was a tall, handsome man, with dark hair and eyes like sloes. All the country people loved him, for he was so skilled in knightly exercises, and had such a sweet and loving nature that no one could help being fond of him. Old people's eyes would brighten at the sight of him, and the little children would run out to greet him as he rode by their mothers' doors. And this was the more remarkable because, with all his winning manner, he had such a lack of conversation that men called him Paul the Silent, or Paul the Taciturn. Harold, on the other hand, was as different from his brother as night is from day. He was fair-haired and blue-eyed, and he had gained for himself the name of Harold the Orator, because he was always free of speech and ready with his tongue. But for all this he was not a favorite, for he was haughty and jealous and quick-tempered, and the old folks' eyes did not brighten at the sight of him, and the babes, instead of toddling out to greet him, hid their faces in their mothers' skirts when they saw him coming. Harold could not help knowing that the people liked his silent brother best, and the knowledge made him jealous of him, so a coldness sprang up between them. Now it chanced one summer that Earl Harold went on a visit to the King of Scotland, accompanied by his mother, the Countess Helga, and her sister, the Countess Fraukirk. and while he was at court he met a charming young Irish lady, the Lady Morna, who had come from Ireland to Scotland to attend upon the Scottish Queen. She was so sweet and good and gentle that Earl Harold's heart was won, and he made up his mind that she, and only she, should be his bride. But although he had paid her much attention, Lady Morna had sometimes caught glimpses of his jealous temper. She had seen an evil expression in his eyes, and had heard him speak sharply to his servants, and she had no wish to marry him. So, to his great amazement, she refused the honor which he offered her, and told him that she would prefer to remain as she was. Earl Harold ground his teeth in silent rage, but he saw that it was no use pressing his suit at that moment, so what he could not obtain by his own merits, he determined to obtain by guile. Accordingly, he begged his mother to persuade the Lady Morna to go back with them on a visit, hoping that when she was alone with him in Orkney, he would be able to overcome her prejudice against him, and induce her to become his wife. And all the while he never remembered his brother Paul, or if he did, he never thought it possible that he could be his rival. But that was just the very thing that happened. The Lady Morna, thinking no evil, accepted the Countess Helga's invitation, and no sooner had the party arrived back in Orkney than Paul, charmed with the grace and beauty of the fair Irish maiden, fell head over ears in love with her, and the Lady Morna, from the very first hour that she saw him, returned his love. Of course, this state of things could not long go on hidden, and when Harold realized what had happened, his anger and jealousy knew no bounds. Seizing a dagger, he rushed up to the turret where his brother was sitting in his private apartments, and threatened to stab him to the heart if he did not promise to give up all thoughts of winning the lovely stranger. But Paul met him with pleasant words. "Calm thyself, brother," he said. "It is true that I love the lady, but that is no proof that I shall win her. Is it likely that she will choose me, whom all men name Paul the Silent, when she hath the chance of marrying you, whose tongue moves so swiftly that to you is given the proud title of Harold the Orator?" At these words Harold's vanity was flattered, and he thought that, after all, his stepbrother was right, and that he had a very small chance with his meagre gift of speech of being successful in his suit. So he threw down his dagger, and shaking hands with him, begged him to pardon his unkind thoughts, and went down the winding stair again in high good humor with himself and all the world. By this time it was coming near to the Feast of Yule, and at that festival it was the custom for the Earl and his court to leave Kirkwall for some weeks, and go to the great palace of Orfeer, 9 miles distant. And in order to see that everything was ready, Earl Paul took his departure some days before the others. The evening before he left he chanced to find the Lady Morna sitting alone in one of the deep windows of the great hall. She had been weeping, for she was full of sadness at the thought of his departure, and at the sight of her distress, the kind-hearted young Earl could no longer contain himself. But, folding her in his arms, he whispered to her how much he loved her, and begged her to promise to be his wife. She agreed willingly. Hiding her rosy face on his shoulder, she confessed that she had loved him from the very first day that she had seen him, and ever since that moment she had determined that, if she could not wed him, she would wed no other man. For a little time they sat together, rejoicing in their new-found happiness. Then Earl Paul sprang to his feet. "Let us go and tell the good news to my mother and brother," he said. "Harold may be disappointed at first, for I know, sweetheart, he would fain have had thee for his own. But his good heart will soon overcome all that, and he will rejoice with us also." But the Lady Morna shook her head. She knew, better than her lover, what Earl Harold's feelings would be, and she would fain put off the evil hour. "Let us hold our peace till after Yule," she pleaded. "It will be a joy to keep our secret to ourselves for a little space, There will be time enough then to let all the world know." Rather reluctantly, Earl Paul agreed, and next day he set off for the palace at Orpheer, leaving his lady love behind him. Little he guessed the danger he was in, for, all unknown to him, his step-aunt, Countess Fraukirk, had chanced to be in the hall the evening before, hidden behind a curtain, and she had overheard every word that Morna and he had spoken, and her heart was filled with black rage. For she was a hard, ambitious woman, and she had always hated the young Earl, who was no blood relation to her, and who stood in the way of his brother, her own nephew. For if Paul were only dead, Harold would be the sole Earl of Orkney. And now that he had stolen the heart of the Lady Morna, whom her own nephew loved, her hate and anger knew no bounds. She had hastened off to her sister's chamber as soon as the lovers had parted, and there the two women had remained talking together till the chilly dawn broke in the sky. Next day a boat went speeding over the narrow channel of water that separates Pomona on the mainland from Hoy. In it sat a woman, but who she was or what she was like no one could say, for she was covered from head to foot with a black cloak, and her face was hidden behind a thick dark veil. Snorro the dwarf knew her even before she laid aside her trappings, for Countess Fraukirk was no stranger to him. In the course of her long life she had often had occasion to seek his aid to help her in her evil deeds, and she had always paid him well for his services, in yellow gold. He therefore welcomed her gladly, but when he had heard the nature of her errand his smiling face grew grave again, and he shook his head. "I have served thee well, lady, in the past," he said, "but methinks that this thing goeth beyond my courage, for to compass an earl's death is a weighty matter, especially when he is so well beloved, as is Earl Paul. Thou knowest why I have taken up my abode in this lonely spot, how I hope some day to light upon the magic carbuncle. Thou knowest also how the people fear me and hate me too, forsooth. And if the young Earl died and suspicion fell on me, I must needs fly the island, for my life would not be worth a grain of sand. Then my chance of success would be gone. Nay, I cannot do it, lady, I cannot do it." But the wily Countess offered him much gold and bribed him higher and higher, first with wealth, then with success, and lastly she promised to obtain for him a high post at the court of the King of Scotland, and at that his ambition stirred within him. His determination gave way, and he consented to do what she asked. "I will summon my magic loom," said he, "and weave a piece of cloth of finest texture and of marvelous beauty, and before I weave it I will so poison the thread with a magic potion that when it is fashioned into a garment, whoever puts it on will die ere he hath worn it many minutes." "Thou art a clever knave," answered the Countess, a cruel smile lighting up her evil face, "and thou shalt be rewarded. Let me have a couple of yards of this wonderful web, and I will make a bonny waistcoat for my fine young Earl and give it to him as a Yuletide gift. Then I reckon that he will not see the year out." "That will he not," said Dwarf Snorro with a malicious grin, and the two parted, after arranging that the piece of cloth should be delivered at the palace of Orpheer on the day before Christmas Eve. Now, when the Countess Fraukirk had been away upon her wicked errand, strange things were happening at the castle of Kirkwall, for Harold, encouraged by his brother's absence, offered his heart and hand once more to the Lady Morna. Once more she refused him, and in order to make sure that the scene should not be repeated, she told him that she had plighted her troth to his brother. When he heard that this was so, rage and fury were like to devour him. Mad with anger, he rushed from her presence, flung himself upon his horse, and rode away in the direction of the seashore. While he was galloping wildly along, his eyes fell on the snow-clad hills of Hoy rising up across the strip of sea that divided the one island from the other. and his thoughts flew at once to Snorro the dwarf, who he had had occasion, as well as his step-aunt, to visit in bygone days. "I have it!" he cried. "Stupid fool that I was not to think of it at once! I will go to Snorro and buy from him a love potion which will make my Lady Morna hate my precious brother and turn her thoughts kindly towards me." So he made haste to hire a boat, and soon he was speeding over the tossing waters on his way to the island of Hoy. When he arrived there, he hurried up the lonely valley to where the dwarfy stone stood, and he had no difficulty in finding its uncanny occupant, for Snorro was standing at the hole that served as a door, his raven on his shoulder, gazing placidly at the setting sun. A curious smile crossed his face when, hearing the sound of approaching footsteps, he turned round and his eyes fell on the young noble. "What bringeth thee here, Sir Earl?" he asked gaily, for he scented more gold. "I come for a love potion," said Harold, and without more ado he told the whole story to the wizard. "I will pay thee for it," he added, "if thou wilt give it to me quickly." Snorro looked at him from head to foot. "Blind must the maiden be, Sir Orator," he said, "who needeth a love potion to make her fancy so gallant a knight." Earl Harold laughed angrily. "It is easier to catch a sunbeam than a woman's roving fancy," he replied. "I have no time for jesting. For hearken, old man, there's a proverb that saith, 'Time and tide wait for no man,' so I need not expect the tide to wait for me. The potion I must have, and that instantly." Snorro saw that he was in earnest, so without a word he entered his dwelling, and in a few minutes returned with a small vial in his hand which was full of a rosy liquid. "Pour the contents of this into the Lady Morna's wine cup," said he, "and I warrant thee that before 24 hours have passed she will love thee better than thou lovest her now." Then he waved his hand as if to dismiss his visitor, and disappeared into his dwelling place. Earl Harold made all speed back to the castle, but it was not until 1 or 2 days had elapsed that he found a chance to pour the love potion into the Lady Morna's wine cup. But at last, one night at supper, he found an opportunity of doing so, and waving away the little page boy, he handed it to her himself. She raised it to her lips, but she only made a pretense at drinking, for she had seen the hated Earl fingering the cup, and she feared some deed of treachery. When he had gone back to his seat, she managed to pour the whole of the wine on the floor, and smiled to herself at the look of satisfaction that came over Harold's face as she put down the empty cup. His satisfaction increased, for from that moment she felt so afraid of him that she treated him with great kindness, hoping that by doing so she would keep in his good graces until the court moved to Orpheer and her own true love could protect her. Harold, on his side, was delighted with her graciousness, for he felt certain that the charm was beginning to work, and that his hopes would soon be fulfilled. A week later the court removed to the royal palace at Orpheer, where Earl Paul had everything in readiness for the reception of his guests. Of course he was overjoyed to meet Lady Morna again, and she was overjoyed to meet him, for she felt that she was now safe from the unwelcome attentions of Earl Harold. But to Earl Harold the sight of their joy was as gall and bitterness, and he could scarcely contain himself, although he still trusted in the efficacy of Snorro the dwarf's love potion. As for the Countess Fraukirk and Countess Helga, they looked forward eagerly to the time when the magic web would arrive, out of which they hoped to fashion a fatal gift for Earl Paul. At last, the day before Christmas Eve, the two wicked women were sitting in the Countess Helga's chamber, talking of the time when Earl Harold would rule alone in Orkney, when a tap came to the window, and on looking round they saw Dwarf Snorro's gray-headed raven perched on the sill, a sealed packet in its beak. They opened the casement, and with a hoarse croak the creature let the packet drop onto the floor. Then it flapped its great wings and rose slowly into the air again, its head turned in the direction of Hoy. With fingers that trembled with excitement, they broke the seals and undid the packet. It contained a piece of the most beautiful material that anyone could possibly imagine, woven in all the colors of the rainbow, and sparkling with gold and jewels. "'Twill make a bonny waistcoat," exclaimed the Countess Fraukirk with an unholy laugh. "The silent Earl will be a braw man when he gets it on." Then without more ado they set to work to cut out and sew the garment. All that night they worked, and all next day, till, late in the afternoon, when they were putting in the last stitches, hurried footsteps were heard ascending the winding staircase, and Earl Harold burst open the door. His cheeks were red with passion, and his eyes were bright, for he could not but notice that, now that she was safe at Orpheer under her true love's protection, the Lady Morna's manner had grown cold and distant again, and he was beginning to lose faith in Snorro's charm. Angry and disappointed, he had sought his mother's room to pour out his story of vexation to her. He stopped short, however, when he saw the wonderful waistcoat lying on the table, all gold and silver and shining colors. It was like a fairy garment, and its beauty took his breath away. "For whom hast thou purchased that?" he asked, hoping to hear that it was intended for him. "'Tis a Christmas gift for thy brother Paul," answered his mother, and she would have gone on to tell him how deadly a thing it was, had he given her time to speak. But her words fanned his fury into madness, for it seemed to him that this hated brother of his was claiming everything. "Everything is for Paul! I am sick of his very name!" he cried. "By my troth, he shall not have this!" And he snatched the vest from the table. It was in vain that his mother and his aunt threw themselves at his feet, begging him to lay it down, and warning him that there was not a thread in it which was not poisoned. He paid no heed to their words, but rushed from the room, and, drawing it on, ran downstairs with a reckless laugh, to show the Lady Morna how fine he was. Alas, alas! Scarce had he gained the hall than he fell to the ground in great pain. Everyone crowded round him, and the two countesses, terrified now by what they had done, tried in vain to tear the magic vest from his body, but he felt that it was too late. The deadly poison had done its work, and waving them aside, he turned to his brother, who in great distress had knelt down and taken him tenderly in his arms. "I wronged thee, Paul," he gasped, "for thou hast ever been true and kind. Forgive me in thy thoughts, and," he added, gathering up his strength for one last effort, and pointing to the two wretched women who had wrought all this misery, "beware of those two women, for they seek to take thy life." Then his head sank back on his brother's shoulder, and, with one long sigh, he died. When he learned what had happened, and understood where the waistcoat came from, and for what purpose it had been intended, the anger of the silent Earl knew no bounds. He swore a great oath that he would be avenged, not only on Snorro the dwarf, but also on his wicked stepmother and her cruel sister. His vengeance was balked, however, for in the panic and confusion that followed Harold's death, the two countesses slipped out of the palace and fled to the coast, and took boat in haste to Scotland, where they had great possessions, and where they were much looked up to, and where no one would believe a word against them. But retribution fell on them in the end, as it always does fall, sooner or later, on everyone who is wicked or selfish or cruel, for the Norsemen invaded the land, and their castle was set on fire, and they perished miserably in the flames. When Earl Paul found that they had escaped, he set out in hot haste for the island of Hoy, for he was determined that the dwarf at least should not escape. But when he came to the Dwarfy Stone, he found it silent and deserted, all trace of its uncanny occupants having disappeared. No one knew what had become of them. A few people were inclined to think that the dwarf and his raven had accompanied the Countess Fraukirk and the Countess Helga on their flight, but the greater part of the islanders held to the belief, which I think was the true one, that the powers of the air spirited Snorro away and shut him up in some unknown place as a punishment for his wickedness, and that his raven accompanied him. At any rate, he was never seen again by any living person, and wherever he went he lost all chance of finding the magic carbuncle. As for the silent Earl and his Irish sweetheart, they were married as soon as Earl Harold's funeral was over, and for hundreds of years afterwards, when the inhabitants of the Orkney Isles wanted to express great happiness, they said, "As happy as Earl Paul and the Countess Morna."